Ayanna Blake had just transferred to Meadow Ridge High. She came from a part of the city most of these kids only whispered about. A place where you learned fast that talking back could get you jumped, and looking soft could get you hurt. She was a fighter, but the bullies didn't see that. They saw a quiet black girl, a target for their cruel games. So they came at her, escalating the bullying every day. Then one afternoon they came with scissors and a plan to get a reaction. Laughter followed. Someone said it was just a joke. The teacher looked away. The room went still. But Ayanna didn't. They thought she was soft. They thought she'd take it. They were wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The sun was too bright for a Monday, washing out the sky in a pale, indifferent blue that made the town feel sterile, untouched, as if everything here had been carefully arranged and scrubbed before the first bell ever rang. Ayanna Blake sat in the back seat of her mother's Honda, watching rows of identical houses slide past the window, each one with trimmed hedges and polished SUVs like they were all trying to out-suburb each other. Her mother hadn't said much during the drive, and Ayanna hadn't expected her to. It had been that way for months. Meals eaten in silence, doors closing a little too firmly, the kind of cold that didn't come from weather. As they pulled into the school's circular front lot, the building loomed clean and sharp, with banners hanging above the entrance reading "Excellence Through Community." Ayanna stared at those words a little longer than she meant to, her jaw clenched, her fingers curled against the cracked pleather of the door handle. Her mother adjusted the rearview mirror, checked her lipstick, and muttered something under her breath that sounded like, "You'll be fine." No hug, no good luck, no real glance in her direction. Just a nod at the school and the subtle tap of fingernails on the steering wheel, like she was already thinking about the errands she had to run after. Ayanna stepped out without a word, the door shutting softly behind her, and for a moment she just stood there, staring at the rows of students streaming through the front doors, backpacks slung carelessly, phones glowing in their hands, laughter echoing like they'd all known each other since kindergarten. No one looked her way, and yet she could feel it, the sideways glances, the whisper that rippled through the air, even if no one actually spoke. She adjusted the strap on her backpack, lifted her chin just a little, and walked through the front entrance like it didn't matter. The first thing she noticed was how clean it all smelled. Not the bleach and metal kind of clean she was used to, but a soft, lemon-scented air that felt curated. The hallways were wide, the lockers painted in two-tone blue, and the floors polished to a shine so smooth they reflected the white ceiling tiles. It was a different world here, quiet in the wrong places, loud in the wrong ones, and structured like a maze where everyone already knew the path but her. Her homeroom teacher, a thin, smile-plastered woman named Ms. Kendricks, greeted her with a tone just a little too sweet to be real. "Welcome, Ayanna. I've heard we've got a strong student joining us." There was something about the way she said strong, the subtle lean on the word, that made Ayanna want to leave the room and never come back. She took the seat assigned to her in the back corner without comment, keeping her gaze fixed on the empty notebook in front of her, while muffled whispers floated around her from the other students. The first few periods passed in a fog. Teachers listing syllabi, classmates eyeing her like a new animal at the zoo. When lunch came, Ayanna carried her tray through the cafeteria like she was crossing open ground in enemy territory. Most of the tables were already clustered, laughter and stories flying fast between people who moved like they belonged. She spotted an empty spot near the edge of the room and made her way there, only to find someone sliding into it seconds before she reached it. No apologies. Just a look that lingered too long. She moved again, finally settling at a lone seat near the exit, eating in silence. It was there that she saw them for the first time. Austin Riddell and his two shadows, Kyle and Brandon. They walked like they owned something, the kind of swagger that came from generations of being told they were the default. Their eyes scanned the cafeteria like they were deciding what to be amused by today. And when Austin's gaze landed on Ayanna, there was a flash of recognition. Not the kind that said, "I know you," but the kind that said, "I've seen your type before." His smile was thin, teeth too perfect, and he nudged Brandon, who let out a low, amused whistle as their heads leaned together like they were sharing a private joke. She didn't look away. She didn't smile. She just stared back, blank and unblinking, until they moved on. The next day, it started small. Someone bumped her shoulder harder than necessary in the hallway. Someone else knocked her pencil off her desk with a casual flick. A snicker here, a whispered name there. Ghetto. She got attitude, thinks she's tough. Ayanna said nothing. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes on the clock, her mind retreating to the familiar rhythm of muscle memory. How to roll her shoulders, how to shift her stance, how to listen for footwork. She'd promised herself no fights. Not here, not again. But there was something in the air, something low, slow, and crawling, that told her this wasn't going to stop. Not until someone made it stop. There was something different about the way the school breathed that second week, like the walls had quietly decided Ayanna Blake didn't belong, and weren't interested in hiding it. The smiles grew tighter, the stares longer, and the air itself felt filtered, like someone had made sure her presence would always feel just slightly out of place. It didn't come all at once. It never did. But piece by piece, the message had begun to form, silent but unmistakable. You don't fit here. In chemistry class, someone behind her snorted after she answered a question correctly, followed by a whisper just loud enough to travel. Must have learned that in hood school. Ayanna paused only briefly, her pencil mid-stroke before she continued writing. She didn't look back. Kyle, the one who'd muttered it, leaned toward Brandon and chuckled under his breath. Straight out of Compton. Over here solving equations. Brandon laughed. Yo, she probably got that answer trading crack for calculators. Ayanna heard every word, but she didn't flinch. She'd learned early that silence, when held just right, could be heavier than any insult. She tapped her pencil lightly against the desk, once, then again, the way she used to tap her fists against concrete before Darius made her wrap them up. 1, 2, still, cold. But ignoring them only made them braver. By gym class, the game had escalated. During basketball drills, Kyle shoved past her, going for a rebound, throwing a shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling. Watch it, Queen Latifah, he sneered as he passed. Ayanna caught herself without falling, straightened slowly, looked right at him. That's not even clever, she said, voice low, measured, not angry, dismissive. Kyle blinked. What? You're not funny, she added, turning away again. Just loud. It was the first time she'd said anything back, and it cracked the air like glass. For a moment, Kyle just stood there, the smirk stuck half-formed on his face. Brandon, behind him, gave a low, ooh, while Austin, always nearby but never too close, tilted his head, watching from the bleachers with a faint smile. He didn't laugh. He just looked at Ayanna like she'd done something interesting. After class, as she walked back through the corridor toward her locker, Austin fell in step beside her, like it had been planned. You got a little mouth on you, he said casually. Ayanna didn't break stride. You got a lot of nothing coming out of yours. He laughed softly. I see what this is. New girl trying to prove something. I'm not trying, she said, eyes straight ahead. And I'm not new. Just relocated. Austin clicked his tongue. Where from? She didn't answer. He leaned in a little, dropping his voice. Bet it wasn't anywhere like this. This time she looked at him. Direct, unmoved, her gaze sharp as wire. Not even close. Austin's smile flickered at the edges, and for the briefest moment, something uncertain flashed in his eyes. Then he stepped back with a short laugh, raising both hands like he'd just been playing. All right, tough girl. Let's see how long that fire lasts. The next morning, she opened her locker to find it had been stuffed with torn-up paper. Scraps from what looked like old grocery ads and ripped notebook pages. At first glance, it seemed random, but as she pulled the clumps out, she saw it. black Sharpie across the torn edges, crude words scrawled across the chaos. Go back. Nobody wants you here. She stood there, motionless, papers fluttering at her feet. A few passing students noticed but didn't stop. One girl glanced, then looked away quickly. Another giggled under her breath and walked faster. Ayanna crouched down, gathered the papers in one hand, stuffed them deep into her backpack, and closed the locker with a soft, deliberate click. She didn't report it, not yet, but someone had seen. Later that afternoon, as she waited for the bus, standing near the shadowed brick columns by the main entrance, a voice broke through the quiet. Not stern, not invasive, just steady. You doing all right here? She turned to see Principal Hughes. He was tall, clean-cut, with skin as dark as her father's, and eyes that seemed to carry entire stories without needing to tell them. He wore a charcoal suit and a quiet presence, like someone who had spent years learning when to speak and when to let silence do the heavy lifting. She gave a slight nod. I'm good. His gaze held hers for a moment longer. You sure? You're not invisible. I never said I was, she replied. He smiled faintly. No, you didn't, but I've seen that look before. She raised an eyebrow. What look is that? The one that says, I know exactly how far I can be pushed before someone learns they picked the wrong one. Ayanna's lips twitched, just slightly. That's pretty specific. I've been here a while, he said simply. And I'm not new either. She glanced at him then. This man who wore his calm-like armor, who hadn't come to offer pity or false comfort, but something heavier. Respect. She nodded once. If anything crosses the line, he said, voice dropping slightly, and you want it documented, you come to me. I'll handle it the right way. What's the right way? The way they don't expect. As the bus rumbled into view, Ayanna gave him one last look. Thanks. He stepped aside and nodded. Anytime, Ms. Blake. She boarded the bus in silence, dropped into the seat beside the window, and let the weight of the day settle across her shoulders like wet cloth. She could feel it now, rising beneath her skin. Not fear, not pain, but something colder, something older. They thought she'd just keep absorbing it, but they hadn't taken anything from her yet. Not really, not yet. It happened on a Wednesday, during that slow stretch of the week where the school's rhythm dragged a little, like even time itself was tired. The sky outside was the kind of dull gray that pressed down on everything, and inside, the hallways felt strangely quiet, like the air had forgotten how to move. Ayanna felt it the moment she walked through the front doors. She didn't have a word for it, but it clung to her skin. Tight, invisible, heavy. She caught them watching her early that day, first in the hallway near her locker, where Austin leaned against the metal like he had nowhere better to be, thumbs tapping casually at his phone, eyes flicking toward her just long enough to make it known. Then during third period, when Brandon kept turning halfway in his seat, whispering to Kyle, both of them smirking like boys who already knew how the day would end. Their laughter was low, but it carried. By fourth period, Ayanna had already started counting the ways they were circling her without touching. Whispers behind her, laughter that started too late, people turning to look, then looking away like they didn't want to get involved. There were no names this time, no shoves, just eyes, watching, measuring. The warning came in the form of silence. It was during sixth period art class that it finally happened. The class had been given a creative freedom hour. Students were scattered across the room with sketch pads, watercolors, glue sticks, and those school-issued scissors with metal blades dulled just enough to seem harmless. The teacher, Ms. Henley, was in the corner talking with a student about portfolio submissions, while others chatted softly or stared blankly at their drawings, more focused on the clock than the paper. Ayanna was seated near the back, her chair angled toward the window, her pencil tracing soft lines on the blank page in front of her. She wasn't drawing anything in particular, just shapes, movement, the act of staying occupied. She didn't notice Brandon move behind her. She didn't hear the blade. It happened fast. So fast, She didn't register what had been done until it was too late. There was the faint sound of scissors opening and closing, the whisper of hair being sliced, and then the sharp tug near her scalp that made her freeze, not from pain, but instinct. She reached up, slowly, her fingers brushing the back of her head. Her hand came away with frayed ends. Her braid, her thick, tightly woven braid, had been cut. The strands fell loosely in her hand, the blunt edge of the severed weave brushing her palm like it didn't understand what had happened either. Behind her, Brandon was laughing. "Yo! Oh my God!" Kyle gasped from across the table. "Did you just... Dude, that's messed up." Brandon held up the severed braid like it was a trophy, swinging it slightly. "I thought she might want to lighten up the load. This stuff's heavy, right?" Ayanna didn't turn around. She stared at the braid in her hand, unmoving. Austin's voice came from across the room, louder now, just theatrical enough to draw attention. "Damn, I didn't think you'd actually do it. That's bold. You think she's gonna cry?" More laughter followed. Soft gasps, shocked whispers, the kind that wrapped around the edges of cruelty and made it into entertainment. Ayanna still hadn't moved. She was staring not at the hair, but past it, through it, at something far away and distant, her body gone still and quiet, in a way that made the sound of laughter seem too sharp, too loud. Brandon's voice dropped closer again, just behind her ear. "Don't take it personal. Just a little joke. You're always so serious. Figured you needed a makeover." That was when she stood. The chair scraped slowly against the floor, and the sound was enough to break the rhythm of laughter in the room. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She simply rose from her seat, turned to face him, and looked down at the braid in his hand. Brandon blinked. "Relax," he said, suddenly unsure. "It's not like it was real or anything." Ayanna stared at him, expression unreadable. "You think that makes it better?" Kyle stepped forward quickly, trying to regain momentum. "Look, no one's trying to hurt feelings. It's just hair, right?" Austin, still lounging in his chair nearby, leaned back and crossed his arms. "I mean, you make it a statement. You wear it like armor. People are gonna test it. That's just how it goes." Ayanna looked at him now, her voice calm, too calm. "You think this is about hair?" Austin smirked. "Isn't it?" She took one step forward, then another, the silence around her growing denser with every movement. Brandon had stopped laughing now, his hand lowered. The braid dropped to the floor. Ms. Henley finally looked up, her face twisting in slow confusion as she glanced between them. "Is something going on?" No one answered. Ayanna's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You don't get to touch me. You don't get to take something from me and call it a joke." Brandon held up his hands. Okay, just calm down." But Ayanna wasn't angry. Not in the way they expected. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crumbling into tears like they might have imagined when they planned this, grinning over some group text. Sure, she'd run out of the room in shame. She was quiet, controlled, watching, and as she took another slow step toward Brandon, something in his face shifted, his grin faltering, his voice catching, the realization setting in that this wasn't over. It had just begun. For a moment, it was as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. The braid lay curled on the floor like something discarded, like roadkill in the middle of a conversation no one wanted to finish. Ms. E. Henley was still frozen behind her desk, eyes flicking between faces, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but not moving, not intervening, not yet. Ayanna stood at the center of the silence, her hands still at her sides, her back straight, her head tilted slightly toward Brandon, who had started stepping away now, as if the distance between them could somehow erase what he'd done. But she wasn't walking toward him anymore. She was calculating. The memory of her cousin's voice echoed somewhere deep in her ribs. Don't move first unless you're forced, but when you do, finish it fast and clean. She could still feel the sting on the back of her scalp where the braid had been severed, a hot throb of humiliation pulsing against her skin. She didn't touch it again. She didn't need to. The damage was done, and the whole room had seen it. Kyle said something low, trying to pull Brandon away. "Dude, chill. Let's go." She's freaking out, but Brandon didn't move. Austin stayed leaned against the back table, arms folded, his eyes sharp now. No more laughter in them, only that wary sort of curiosity, like he'd misjudged something and wasn't quite sure how to fix it. Ayanna finally stepped forward, slow and measured, her gaze locked on Brandon. He raised a hand like he meant to explain. "Look, I said I was sorry, okay? It was just hair. It's not like we—" Her fist connected before he finished. There was no hesitation, no telegraph, just a brutal, sudden snap of her shoulder and a clean right hook that landed square against his cheekbone. The sound was sharp and ugly, cartilage cracking, followed by the dull thud of his body hitting the art table behind him. The table rocked violently, jars of paint scattering, students gasping as Brandon dropped, stunned and crumpled, clutching his face with both hands as blood poured from his nose. Ms. Henley screamed something now, but Ayanna had already moved. Kyle lunged toward her, but she shifted sideways and grabbed his arm mid-swing, twisting his wrist back and slamming his elbow down across the edge of the table. He shrieked, buckled, then dropped with a choked moan as he cradled his arm, tears springing to his eyes as he slumped against the floor. Austin moved next, not to fight, but to step between them, hands lifted. All right, back up. You made your point. You win, okay?" Ayanna didn't blink. "No," she said, her voice colder than steel. "You don't get to talk." Austin's mouth twitched, but he didn't push it. He took a slow step back, hands still raised. But his face was different now. The arrogance was gone. What remained was recognition. Quiet, tense, and edged with fear. A group of students backed toward the door. Some watched with wide eyes. Others pulled out their phones, fumbling to record, unsure if they should help or hide. Ms. Henley finally snapped out of it, reaching for the intercom button at her desk and shouting down the hallway. "We need assistance in room 316, right now. Security, now!" Ayanna stood in the center of the wreckage. Paint bottles overturned, chairs knocked sideways, paper scattered like fallen leaves. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't flushed or panicked. She was still. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, then dropped to the braid on the floor. She picked it up, held it in her hands like something sacred, then turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She walked calmly through the door and into the hallway, her shoes echoing against the linoleum with a rhythm that seemed too even for what had just happened. She could hear chaos building behind her, students shouting, footsteps pounding, Ms. Henley's voice shrill with panic. But Ayanna didn't stop. She moved down the corridor like she already knew where she'd be taken, already knew what they would say, already knew that none of it mattered. By the time the assistant principal rounded the corner with 2 campus officers in tow, she was waiting. She stood quietly at the edge of the stairwell, hands behind her back, the severed braid dangling loosely from her grip. They shouted for her to freeze. She didn't move. They rushed up, voices raised, hands half reaching for restraints, but it wasn't necessary. She didn't resist when they flanked her. She didn't protest as they walked her toward the main office. She didn't speak as they asked her what happened. She just kept her eyes ahead, jaw set, her silence heavy enough to hush the hallway around them. Word had already spread by the time she arrived at the front office. Students were lined against the walls, pretending to look at posters, straining to hear through the door. Someone whispered her name. Someone else muttered. She snapped. A third voice said, "They cut her hair." And that, more than anything else, rippled through the crowd like static. Inside the principal's office, Darnell Hughes stood waiting. He didn't look surprised when they walked her in. He was black, tall, his presence quiet but unshakable, dressed in dark slacks and a gray button-up with sleeves rolled to the elbows. He dismissed the security staff with a brief nod. "Close the door," he said. They hesitated. "She's not going anywhere. You can close it." The door shut with a soft click. Principal Hughes studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Ayana." She did. The office was quiet, sealed off from the chaos outside. The door closed with purpose, not formality. Ayana sat rigid in the chair across from Principal Hughes's desk, the severed braid still in her hand, her fingers curled tightly around it like she hadn't yet decided if it was something to protect or something to bury. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, and outside, through the thick paneled window, she could see a few students lingering near the hallway corners, trying to pretend they weren't listening. Principal Hughes didn't look at the window. His gaze stayed on her. His elbows rested on the desk, hands folded, body still. Not stiff, but deliberate. The way a man sits when he knows every word about to be spoken matters more than anything else that came before. "I read the report from the art teacher," he said quietly, his voice even, but weighted. "She said you attacked 3 students. One's got a broken nose. Another's being sent for x-rays on his arm." Ayana didn't respond. Her eyes dropped to the floor for a brief moment, not in shame, but in thought, measured, calm, bracing for the storm she knew was coming. "Let me ask you again," Hughes continued, leaning forward slightly. "Why?" Ayana's voice came softer this time, more tired than angry. "They cut my hair." He nodded, not with surprise, not as if the words startled him, but like they confirmed something he'd already suspected deep in his bones. Still, he let the silence hang a moment longer, studying her with a patience that didn't feel like judgment. "I figured that's what it was," he said finally. "I watched the security feed from the hallway after you walked out. You didn't run. You didn't resist. You waited. That's not the kind of reaction that comes from someone who just snapped." Her eyes flicked up now, meeting his, not with challenge, but curiosity. She hadn't expected that. Not from an administrator, not from an adult in a pressed shirt and clean office who could have buried her in a dozen disciplinary buzzwords and official protocols by now. "Most people," he continued, "when they hear a black girl fought 3 white boys and sent 2 of them to the nurse, they think one thing. They think violence. They think rage. They think threat." "I know," she said, her voice flat. "They always do. But when I hear it," he said, his tone lowering, growing slower, "I start asking what happened before the fight. I ask what didn't get recorded, what got laughed off, what teachers missed or ignored, and most of the time, if I'm being honest," he exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, "no one wants those questions answered." Ayana sat back in the chair, still holding the braid. "I didn't want to fight," she said after a beat. "I wanted to finish the day. Go home. Breathe. That's all." "Then why didn't you walk away?" She looked at him, her eyes dry, her mouth pulled tight against the rising heat in her throat. "Because I've walked away 100 times. Because I've ignored the comments, the little things, the accidents. Because I sat still and didn't react, and it only made them push harder. Laugh louder. Get bolder." She opened her palm then, showing him the frayed, uneven end of the braid. "And then they took this." Principal Hughes stared at the braid, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't just hair." "No," she said. "It never is." There was a long pause. He leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaled again, then spoke with the kind of quiet that carried more weight than yelling ever could. "My grandmother used to braid my cousin's hair every Sunday. Said it was part of her crown. Said the world would try to rip it off one way or another, through policies, through stares, through silence. But if you wore it with pride, if you knew what it meant, then nobody could take it without a fight." Ayana didn't smile, but something in her shoulders loosened slightly. "I have to suspend you," he said, voice steady now. 3 days, out of school." "I figured," she replied. "But I'm not expelling you," he added quickly. "They're going to push for that. Parents, board members, maybe even the district. They're going to say you're a danger, that you need to be removed." Ayana's lips pressed together. "And when they do," he said, "I'm going to ask for the footage from inside that classroom. I'm going to file a report of my own." I'm going to start asking questions that make people uncomfortable. She watched him carefully. Why? Because, he said slowly, I've spent my whole life walking the line between doing the job they gave me and doing the job that matters. And today, I've decided those two things don't have to be different anymore. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a plain manila envelope, sliding it across the desk. Inside is your suspension paperwork. You'll sign it, I'll file it, and you'll go home. She took the envelope but didn't open it. But that's not the end of this, he said. You understand me? She nodded once, slowly. You've been fighting alone since the first day you walked in here, he said. You don't have to anymore. Her grip loosened on the braid, just slightly, as if some part of her was starting to believe him. And for the first time since she'd stepped into that room, she said something that sounded almost like hope. Okay. The morning after the incident, the school parking lot filled earlier than usual. The sky was still pale with sunrise when the first black SUV rolled up to the administration building, followed by a silver Lexus and a polished white BMW with tinted windows that didn't belong to any teacher on staff. They came in waves, buttoned up and loud in that quiet, controlled way. The kind of presence that didn't need to shout to take up space. They were the kind of parents who didn't ask questions. They arrived expecting explanations, apologies, and consequences. Principal Hughes stood at the edge of the hallway, watching the storm gather through the tall windows by the main entrance. He didn't move right away. He sipped his coffee slowly, unmoved by the urgency of the front desk's frantic voice through the intercom. They're here, sir. Should we bring in a mediator? Do you want backup from the board? He pressed the button gently, his voice calm. No. Send them to the conference room. I'll be there shortly. When he stepped into the room, they were already standing. All three fathers, all three mothers. Expensive coats slung over chairs, polished watches glinting beneath the soft ceiling lights. They looked at him the way corporate executives look at a man they've already decided is replaceable. One of the mothers, a blonde in a red blazer and pearl necklace, had her arms crossed and lips pursed so tightly they looked bloodless. Her eyes locked on him the moment he entered. You're Principal Hughes, she said. It wasn't a question. I am, he replied, nodding once. They didn't sit down, and neither did he. The silence stretched between them until the tallest of the men, a broad-shouldered figure in a tailored suit and tan trench coat, took a step forward. Let's skip the pleasantries, he said. My son came home with a busted nose and a black eye. You want to explain to me why the girl who did it isn't in a holding cell? She was suspended, Hughes replied evenly. 3 days, out of school, standard protocol for physical altercations resulting in injury. That wasn't an altercation, the blonde woman snapped. It was a savage attack. No, Hughes said calmly. It was a response. The room tensed. Excuse me, another father said. Brandon's, if Hughes remembered correctly. You're defending her? I'm stating the facts, Hughes said, his voice low but firm. Your sons approached a student during class, used a pair of school-issued scissors to cut her hair without her consent, and then publicly mocked her afterward. That's assault. That's humiliation. That's emotional violence. And it provoked a physical response. You don't understand what you're saying, the blonde woman hissed. You're trying to justify violence against white students. No, Hughes said, his tone sharpening just slightly. I'm trying to justify truth. One of the men stepped closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, but far more dangerous. We've been generous with this school, with this district. I sit on the school board. My firm sponsors your athletics department. And now my son is afraid to come to school because you're allowing some girl with a chip on her shoulder to, I'm allowing her to attend a school where she was enrolled, where she has every right to be, and where she should have been protected from the moment she arrived. Hughes interrupted, his voice clear now, cutting through the layered entitlement with the precision of a scalpel. You're not angry because your sons were attacked. You're angry because someone fought back, and you weren't prepared for what that looked like. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was volatile, vibrating just under the surface, with the barely restrained fury of people who'd spent their entire lives being listened to. One of the mothers shook her head slowly, speaking now with the cold clarity of someone who knew where her power came from. You realize this is going to escalate, don't you? We're not going to let this go. Not after what she did. Not after the media gets wind of it. I'm counting on it, Hughes said simply. They blinked, confused. He stepped around the conference table, now moving slowly, deliberately, his tone softening just enough to force them to lean in. Because once the media gets wind of it, they'll also get the footage of 3 boys surrounding a girl in class, cutting her hair, laughing, threatening. Once the media sees that tape, I'm willing to bet the public will understand why that girl defended herself. And, if not the media, then the courts. You wouldn't, one of them growled. I already have, he replied. The footage is being reviewed by the district superintendent as we speak. So if you're here to file complaints, by all means, I'll add them to the documentation. But if you're here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. One of the fathers pointed a finger. You'll lose your job over this. Hughes smiled faintly. If I do, it'll be doing the right thing. They didn't respond to that. Not with words. Instead, they gathered their coats in silence, their movements stiff with the kind of anger that came from knowing they hadn't won. The blonde mother reached the door last, pausing just long enough to glance over her shoulder. You've made a serious mistake. Hughes looked back at her, his expression calm, unmoved. No, ma'am, he said quietly. I've made a choice. The tension didn't fade after the meeting. It only changed shape. The parents had stormed out without getting what they came for, but that didn't mean they'd stopped. The emails started that same afternoon, carbon copied to board members and the superintendent, full of sharp language and veiled threats about campus safety and maintaining district standards. There were murmurs of lawsuits, whispers about donors reconsidering their support, and warnings passed down through administrative channels about the optics of the situation. Principal Hughes read every line with quiet, surgical focus. He printed them all, filed them by name, timestamp, tone. He responded only when he had to, and when he did, his replies were brief, formal, and always included a copy of the video timestamp that showed exactly what had happened in that classroom. The footage wasn't graphic. It didn't show fists or blood, but it showed something worse. Austin leaning back with a smirk, Brandon hovering behind Ayanna with scissors, and the moment her braid was taken, like it was nothing. Hughes didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He documented. And while he was doing that, Ayanna watched. She returned to school on the 4th day, walking through the front doors without looking left or right, her back straight, her face unreadable. The whispers followed her down the hall like smoke, curling between lockers and brushing past eavesdropping students who weren't bold enough to speak aloud. Some stared, some turned away. A few watched with something like awe, like they couldn't decide whether she was dangerous or just untouchable now. She made it through the day with minimal interference. Teachers avoided eye contact. No one called on her in class. The air around her had shifted, heavier now, electric in a way that made people keep their distance. But it wasn't fear she carried. It was something deeper. It was control. In the afternoon, Principal Hughes called her to his office. Not with a referral slip or a reprimand, just a quiet message passed through a guidance counselor. He'd like to see you when you're free. She found him leaning over a row of binders in his office, his desk unusually cluttered with printouts, meeting notes, and security logs. He gestured for her to close the door. You okay walking in here? He asked without looking up. She gave a slight shrug. I'm used to people watching me. He nodded, standing straight. Good, because they still are. He motioned for her to sit, then placed a single manila folder in front of her. Inside were printed photos, screenshots from security footage. One showed Brandon standing behind her. Another, clearer, captured the scissors midair. No blood, no action, just evidence. I've sent this to the superintendent, he said, and I'm drafting a report to submit to the state. It'll get buried if it comes from me alone. But if a pattern shows up—" "What pattern?" she asked, watching him closely. Hughes tapped a finger on the edge of the folder. "That's where you come in." She leaned forward, brows tightening. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin, spiral-bound notebook, the kind handed out at staff trainings, and slid it across the desk. Inside were 3 names she recognized. Students of color, all quiet, all recent transfers. Each one had a brief note beside their name. Grade drop. Locker vandalized. Report dismissed. Disciplinary warning issued. "I started keeping track last semester," he said. "Not just because of you, because it's been happening a long time. Just small enough to get ignored." Ayanna stared at the names, reading them twice. "They never came forward?" "Some tried," Hughes said. "Got brushed off. Told to adjust, to be less sensitive. Told that not everything was about race." Ayanna looked up. "But it is, exactly," he said. She sat back, her fingers resting lightly on the notebook. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to watch," he said, carefully. "If you see something, write it down. Names, times, teachers who look away, students who start pushing things further. Document everything. But don't engage unless you have to." "You think they're still going to come at me?" "I know they are," he said. "But not the same way. They're going to use policy now. Dress code violations. Aggressive language. Anything they can twist to make you look unstable." Ayanna exhaled slowly. "So, I'm bait." "No," Hughes said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Your leverage." He sat across from her, folding his hands. "They underestimated you. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming that you were alone." She met his gaze, eyes narrowing. "And what happens if I do this? And it doesn't change anything?" "Then we make it louder," he said. "But first, we make it undeniable." She nodded once, just slightly. And that was how it began. Not with a march or a headline, but with a quiet notebook passed between 2 people who understood the system too well to trust it. Ayanna carried it in the bottom of her backpack, buried beneath her books, hidden like a weapon with the safety still on. In the following weeks, she watched. She listened. She wrote. It didn't take long for the school's surface calm to start unraveling, not in dramatic ways, but in quiet, granular fractures, the kind that didn't make headlines, but bled through routine like rust under paint. A week after Ayanna returned from her suspension, the morning announcements included a rushed reminder about respectful conduct and appropriate appearance. The phrasing so vague it might have applied to anyone, but the timing made it clear who it was meant for. Students exchanged looks. Some rolled their eyes. Others glanced sideways at her desk, like she was a loaded question they weren't ready to answer. Ayanna didn't react. She'd learned to let the first wave roll past. It was never about that moment. It was about what followed. In the second week, she saw it happen again. Another girl, smaller than her, Latina, shoved in the hallway by a boy twice her size, his laughter careless, his voice sharp with the kind of mockery that sounded playful to anyone not paying attention. When she turned to defend herself, a teacher appeared just in time to scold her for raising her voice. Ayanna wrote down the time, the names, the teacher's indifference. She didn't intervene. Not yet. At lunch, she began noticing how certain students seemed to orbit one another. Always the same clusters, always the same side glances when she entered the cafeteria. Kyle had returned, arm in a brace, walking slower now, quieter too, but still flanked by Brandon and 2 others who hadn't been involved before. The group had shifted shape, but not purpose. They didn't speak to her. They didn't need to. The message came in posture, in the sudden silence that followed her steps, in the way laughter died down when she passed. She felt it tightening. At the same time, Principal Hughes was moving differently. He was still composed, still measured in tone, but there was a new rhythm beneath his calm, a quiet urgency threaded through his days. He met with counselors more often. held longer meetings behind closed doors, and sent late-night emails to district officials that used words like pattern of misconduct and administrative negligence. He copied Ayanna on nothing, but she knew. She could see it in the way his eyes scanned the halls. Sharper now, slower. One evening, he called her into his office again, this time after most of the building had cleared out. The windows reflected the soft amber of sunset across the glass, and the front desk had already gone dark. He didn't offer a chair. He stood by the window, arms folded, and nodded toward the door behind her. "Lock it," he said quietly. She did, without asking why. He turned back and gestured toward a small folder on his desk. "Someone sent that to me anonymously. Internal staff thread, forwarded from a teacher account." Ayanna opened the folder and scanned the contents. A string of emails. The language was coded, but unmistakable. Teachers discussing recurring discipline problems tied to students from less structured homes. Another line referenced outside cultural influences. And though no names were included, the context was clear. She read a line aloud, her voice cold. "Some of these girls come in here looking for trouble. They need structure, not sympathy." Principal Hughes leaned against the desk, his arms still crossed. That was from a faculty member on Ayanna's third-period rotation, the same one who ignored Brandon's first incident. She let the paper fall back onto the desk. "They're building a case against me." He nodded once. "Not just you. Against everything that threatens their version of order. Even if it's the truth? Especially if it's the truth." Ayanna's jaw tightened. "So what now?" "We watch for fractures," he said. "And when they start to split, we drive the wedge." The wedge came faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, one of the janitors, a quiet black man named Reggie, who usually kept to himself, stopped Ayanna in the hallway just as the bell rang for last period. His voice was low, eyes darting toward the empty hallway. "I saw what happened in the art room," he said quickly. "That day, I was replacing a light fixture above the exit. No one looked up." Ayanna stared at him. "Why are you telling me now?" He hesitated. "Because I've seen this before. Not the scissors, the aftermath, the way they twist it, the way it eats people." She nodded slowly. "Would you say it, if someone asked?" His eyes flicked to the hallway again. "If the right person asked." When she relayed the conversation to Principal Hughes, his expression didn't change. He only murmured, "That's the beginning." Another fracture appeared during a routine staff meeting when a young English teacher, Miss Chandler, barely out of grad school, asked during the equity segment why no students had been interviewed before the district issued its statement about the fight. Her voice trembled, but the question landed like a crack of thunder. No one answered. The next day, she found her name missing from the professional development committee she'd been assigned to all year. Ayanna recorded that too. She wrote everything. She watched the system bend and reposition, watched teachers avoid her eyes, watched students choose sides without saying a word. She wasn't a mystery anymore. She was a test, and no one wanted to be the one who failed it. It started again during lunch, because of course it did. It was always in the places where teachers looked but didn't see, where administrators assumed a quiet cafeteria meant everything was fine. Ayanna was sitting alone, as usual, her tray mostly untouched, her back to the window near the far end of the room where the light poured in, but never quite reached her. She liked that spot. Quiet, half-shadowed, a place where she could observe without being observed. But today, she could feel it before she saw it. The shift, the way the voices behind her got just a little louder. The familiar cadence of Brandon's laughter, Kyle's mock whispering, and Austin's voice, measured but dripping with performance, like everything he said was meant for an invisible audience. They hadn't tried anything in days, maybe weeks, but she should have known better than to assume they were done. She kept her head down. At first it was small. A grape rolled across her table. Then a balled-up napkin landed next to her tray. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her pen moved steadily across the corner of a blank notebook page, recording each thing as it came. 11:38. Grape rolled across table from northwest angle. 11:40. Napkin tossed from Kyle, laughing. 11:42. Brandon mimicking my posture, mocking voice under breath. 11:43. Austin speaking louder now, watching me for a reaction. And then, 11:44. Plastic fork hits tray. Why don't you smile? From Austin. That was when she looked up, slowly, calmly. Her eyes met Austin's, and he froze just briefly, just long enough for the performance to falter. She didn't speak. She didn't scowl or retreat. She simply held his gaze until he looked away, coughed, and turned back to his friends like he hadn't just lost something he couldn't name. She didn't need to fight them anymore. She just had to watch them fail in real time. She stood, picked up her tray, walked past their table without rushing, without a word. As she passed, Kyle muttered under his breath, "Crazy witch." But she was already gone, walking straight toward the main office. The tight coil of rage in her chest wound so tightly it burned without smoke. She asked to see Principal Hughes. The secretary hesitated. "He was in a meeting," she said. "Maybe she could leave a note." "No," Ayanna said evenly. "I'll wait." She stood in the corner near the glass case of trophies, not moving, her expression unreadable. It took 15 minutes. She didn't shift once. When Hughes emerged from his office, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, he spotted her immediately and raised a brow. "You all right?" "Now I am," she said. He opened the door without asking why she was there. Inside, she placed her notebook on the desk and slid it toward him, open to the latest page. He read in silence, nodding as his eyes moved line by line. "They're starting again," she said quietly, "testing the boundaries, seeing what they can get away with now that the heat's died down. Anyone else see it?" She nodded. "A few students, maybe 2 tables over. One teacher near the front." But she was on her phone. Hughes flipped the page, saw a note in the corner written in small, precise print. "Camera location. Northeast corner. Diagonal line of sight blocked by pillar unless seated." He looked up, surprised. "You mapped the blind spots." Ayanna's voice didn't change. "You said to make it undeniable." His lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close to approval. "You've been listening. They don't think they're being watched," she said. "They think no one cares." "Most people don't," he replied. "Not until it touches them directly." He pulled out his phone, typed a quick message, then turned back to her. "I'll request the lunchroom footage from the district's IT office before they can tamper with it. But we'll need statements. Witnesses. They won't speak," she said. "Not unless someone else does first." "You volunteering?" he asked. Ayanna met his gaze. "I'll go first." There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, let's make this official." They drafted a report together, her notes laid out in clean, unbroken detail. Timestamps, names, descriptions. His tone remained calm as he typed, but his fingers moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was done asking for permission. When they finished, he looked at her and said, "They're not going to like this." "I'm not trying to be liked," she said. "You're trying to be heard." She nodded. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Then it's time we give you a microphone." It started small, the way all reckonings do. First with a flicker of doubt in places used to certainty. Then with voices that didn't shout, but couldn't be ignored. After Ayanna filed her statement, after Hughes sent the video request and secured the footage before anyone could interfere, something subtle shifted in the building. It was hard to name at first, but she felt it in the way the front office grew quieter when she passed, in the way some teachers paused too long before asking her to read aloud or hand out papers. No one said anything outright. No one had to. The fear wasn't of what she'd done, but of what she might do next. The principal, meanwhile, moved with a deliberate calm that masked how fast things were building beneath the surface. Meetings with district liaisons became more frequent. His inbox filled with carefully worded questions from school board members who had previously kept their distance. But what none of them realized, at least not yet, was that Hughes wasn't trying to calm the waters. He was waiting for the tide to rise. By the end of that week, the footage from the lunchroom had been logged, clipped, and submitted alongside Ayana's report. In the video, the events played out with no commentary, no edits. You could see her sitting alone, unmoving, while the boys behind her laughed, tossed food, mocked her posture. At 11:44, you could clearly hear Austin's voice. "Why don't you smile?" followed by the long, waited pause when she turned and stared. That moment, that silence, was more damning than any act of violence. When Hughes submitted the report to the district, he attached not just the footage and Ayana's written account, but a string of other documents, photocopied disciplinary records from the previous year, filed complaints from 3 other students who'd reported the same group of boys, all dismissed as unsubstantiated. Names, dates, patterns. The kind of paper trail that wasn't dramatic, but meticulous. Heavy. A local journalist, a young black woman named Lena Mercer, who had covered education politics in the district for years, caught wind of the growing unrest. She reached out directly to Hughes, then to Ayana, careful in her questions, never pushing too hard. She'd seen enough stories like this fall apart the moment they were sensationalized. What made this one different, she said, was the clarity, the paper, the video, the silence. She asked Ayana for an interview. Ayana agreed, but not for television, not for drama. A sit-down, one camera, no lights, just her voice. They met in the media room after school hours, long after the hallways had emptied, and the afternoon sun had dimmed to the kind of gold that made shadows long and soft. Hughes waited outside, not hovering, just nearby. The custodian paused to listen. The security guard didn't interrupt. When Ayana sat across from the camera, hands resting on her thighs, her expression unreadable, Lena pressed record and said, "Say only what you want. No more, no less." Ayana didn't look nervous. She looked tired, but sharp. She didn't talk about the fight. She talked about being watched, about being mocked, about the moment she sat in the bathroom stall after her braid was cut, staring at the broken strands in her hand, and how the sound of laughter through the door wasn't loud but sharp, the kind of sound that broke through skin. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She spoke with the weight of someone who had already lived through the worst part and wasn't asking for pity. When Lena asked her what she hoped would happen now, she said simply, "I want the truth to stop being quiet." The interview aired that weekend, quietly, on the outlet's YouTube page, and embedded in a small article titled, "Student Speaks After Haircutting Incident Sparks Controversy at Local High School." It wasn't viral, it wasn't sensational, but it was clear, and that clarity spread like oil across water. By Monday, parents were calling the school, not to complain, but to ask questions. Was it true? Had there been other complaints? Why weren't students protected? Who was watching? That was when the real cracks appeared. A former teacher commented anonymously on the article, admitting she'd once filed a report about Brandon harassing a Somali student during lunch, and was told to document it and move on. Another parent shared an email thread between a guidance counselor and a dean, where concerns about racial tension were dismissed with the phrase, "We don't want to inflame things unnecessarily." Miss Chandler, the English teacher who had once dared to speak during the staff meeting, shared the interview publicly on her social media account with a single line, "This isn't new. This is just finally visible." She was quietly reassigned the following week. Students noticed. By Wednesday, the superintendent scheduled a mandatory meeting at the school. By Friday, the school board issued a statement calling for a third-party review of campus disciplinary practices. And through it all, Ayana moved through the halls exactly as she had before. Shoulders square, gaze steady, saying nothing unless spoken to. She didn't need to speak. Her silence had done the work. Now it was everyone else who had to explain themselves. By the end of the following week, the walls had started closing in. Not around Ayana, but around the institution that had once shielded the boys without hesitation. The school board's public announcement of an independent investigation made the front page of the local paper. The words were carefully chosen, wrapped in phrases like commitment to equity and reviewing our disciplinary systems. But beneath the gloss was something real, something unmistakable: fear. There were too many eyes now, too many questions, too much proof. Principal Hughes moved through it all with quiet precision. He didn't attend the press briefings. He didn't give interviews. He simply kept doing what he had been doing all along: documenting, listening, gathering every memo, every ignored complaint, every timestamp that connected one pattern to another. He had grown more than cautious. He had become deliberate. Every word he spoke now was chosen with care. Every meeting held behind closed doors ended with a paper trail, and Ayanna, for all the attention that swirled around her, kept to her pattern. She arrived each morning on time. She submitted her assignments. She walked from class to class without spectacle. Her silence, once treated as defiance, had become something else entirely: authority. Then came the moment they couldn't bury. On a Monday morning, thick with drizzle and heavy clouds, the district released its first findings, quietly. No press conference, just a written summary sent to the inboxes of every parent and staff member, with the subject line, Preliminary Review Update. Inside were 7 paragraphs, but only one mattered. We have confirmed that multiple prior complaints involving the same group of students were not investigated appropriately or escalated through the proper channels. Corrective action will be taken. That single sentence detonated. Within hours, Brandon's name was trending locally. Someone leaked the security footage from the lunchroom to a student-run account on social media. And from there, it spread fast. Shared, reposted, dissected. The moment Austin threw the fork, the mocking laughter, the taunt, the silence, the stare. What no one expected was what followed next, not from Ayanna, but from within the boys' own circles. A sophomore girl posted a long thread detailing how Kyle had harassed her during sophomore orientation, how she reported it, and was told she may have misinterpreted the behavior. She had saved the email. She posted screenshots. A former student, now in college, commented on the video with a single line: "That's the same boy who followed me to my car 3 times and was never written up." The thread grew longer. The tone changed. And then came the final shift, the one that couldn't be ignored. That Thursday, in a quiet district hearing not meant to be public, Ayanna and Principal Hughes were both invited to speak. Not just about the incident, but about the larger culture that had allowed it. She didn't want to go at first. She told Hughes it would be performative, that nothing would change, but he didn't try to convince her with hope. He used history. "Sometimes they don't change because of a speech," he said, as they sat side by side in his office, both watching the slow crawl of headlines refresh on his monitor. "Sometimes they change because they run out of ways to lie." So she agreed. The hearing wasn't in a courtroom. It was in a narrow district building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, the kind of place meant to make things feel smaller than they are. But the room was full. Parents, teachers, community organizers, a few reporters who had managed to squeeze past the sign-in table. Ayanna stood at the front of the room in a plain black sweater. No jewelry, no frills. Just her. No note cards, no script. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for sympathy. She told them what had happened. She told them what had happened before it. And when someone from the board asked carefully, "Do you feel that justice has been served for you?" she answered without flinching, "I don't need justice to come quickly. I need it to come fully, and not just for me." There was a pause after that. Long, still, uncomfortable. But no one interrupted. Later that afternoon, a formal letter of disciplinary action was issued against Brandon, Kyle, and Austin. It used words like harassment, targeted misconduct, and administrative negligence. The letter was not released publicly, but by then it didn't matter. The silence that had protected them had already collapsed. By Friday, Brandon had withdrawn from the school. Kyle's parents had requested a transfer. Austin remained, but he walked with his head down now, his posture deflated, the weight of consequence finally visible in every step. He avoided Ayanna entirely. She didn't need to say anything when she passed him in the hall. He already knew, and so did everyone else. The school felt different now, not because the building had changed, but because the illusion around it had cracked. The walls still stood. The hallways still echoed with chatter. The bells still rang with the same mechanical indifference, but the silence had lost its power. There were still students who looked at Ayanna like she was a threat, still teachers who kept their voices tight when addressing her, but none of them held the kind of certainty they once had. What had once been assumed, that she would stay quiet, that she would absorb, that she would survive and disappear, was gone. What remained was the question no one could ignore. What would she do next? It was during fifth period, on a Wednesday marked by thick clouds and the faint scent of coming rain, that Principal Hughes asked to see her again. Not with urgency, not with pressure, just a quiet message delivered through a student aide, folded neatly and placed on her desk. She walked into his office with the same calm steps she always used now, each one measured, quiet, self-contained. He gestured for her to sit, but this time there were no papers on his desk, no files, no emails pulled up on the screen. Just him, seated across from her, hands folded. A certain stillness in his expression that told her this wasn't administrative. "I got a call this morning," he said slowly, "from the district superintendent. They've finalized the external report. The board is meeting tomorrow to go over recommendations. They'll be issuing public statements soon after." She nodded once, waiting. "They're going to issue a formal apology," he continued. "To you, in writing, publicly." Ayanna blinked, but not with surprise. And they're offering you the chance to speak at the press conference. Just a few minutes. Nothing mandatory. It's your decision." She leaned back slightly in the chair, not defensive, just thoughtful. "They think if I speak, it'll fix everything." "No," Hughes said. "They think if you speak, it'll make them look like they care." Her eyes met his, steady and sharp. "And what do you think?" He paused, just long enough to make her believe the answer mattered. "I think this is yours now. All of it. The story, the voice, the direction. You've been in control longer than they've known. But speaking up now? That makes it official. That makes it yours in the open." She sat with that for a moment, turning it over. Not for pride, not for vengeance, but for clarity. "What happens if I don't?" "They'll still apologize," he said. "They'll still update the policy. They'll still implement new training modules and hold workshops and promise change. But it'll fade. Sooner or later, another story will take its place." She nodded slowly. "And if I do speak, then it doesn't fade. Then it's documented in your voice. Then it becomes something permanent." She glanced toward the window, where raindrops had started to form slow streaks along the glass. Outside, students were crossing the courtyard, their umbrellas like little black shields bobbing between puddles. She watched them move, the rhythm of it familiar, unbothered by what had happened within these walls. But she wasn't bitter. She was ready. "I'll speak," she said finally. Hughes gave a quiet nod. "I thought you might." But it wasn't just the press conference she was thinking about. There was one last conversation she needed to have. One final piece that hadn't yet fallen into place. Austin. He hadn't spoken to her since the disciplinary action came down. Brandon and Kyle were gone, pulled from the school, their families vanishing behind a thick fog of lawyers and public silence. But Austin had remained. He moved like a ghost now, quieter than before, careful not to make eye contact, careful not to speak out of turn. His swagger had evaporated, replaced by a kind of cautious awareness that followed him into every classroom, every hallway, every passing glance. She found him after school, in the back lot where the older students parked. He was leaning against his car, phone in hand, earbuds dangling from his collar, head down. He didn't notice her approach until her shadow crossed his feet. When he looked up, the fear was instant, but she didn't stop. "I'm not here to fight," she said quietly. He didn't answer. She stood in front of him, letting the silence stretch between them, waiting until he looked at her like a person, not a threat. She stood in front of him, letting the silence stretch between them, waiting until he looked at her like a person, not a threat. "You ever think about why you did it?" she asked. His brow furrowed. "Did what?" She tilted her head. "Cut my hair. Said what you said. Laughed when they did it." "What was it supposed to be?" He swallowed hard. "It was a joke." She nodded slowly, not breaking eye contact. "You thought you were allowed." He blinked. "I didn't." "You did," she cut in. "You thought nothing would happen, that I'd take it, that someone like me didn't have a right to dignity." Austin said nothing. "I don't need an apology," she added. "And I'm not here to hear one. I just wanted you to understand something." He shifted, uncomfortable. "You didn't break me," she said. "You revealed yourself." And with that, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. The press conference was held in the auditorium. Neutral ground, according to the district's lawyers. A space that belonged to no one, but would hold the weight of everything. They cleared the first 6 rows for press and board members. Camera crews arrived early, adjusting lighting and mic levels. Wires coiled like snakes across the stage floor. Outside, reporters stood beneath gray skies, voices clipped and formal as they narrated the district's attempt at healing. Inside, the tension hummed beneath every polite greeting and folded program. Principal Hughes stood near the side of the stage, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, calm as ever. His expression hadn't changed from the day he'd first called Ayanna into his office, the same quiet readiness, the same understanding that real power didn't always look loud. It looked like this. Ayanna waited behind the curtain, flanked by a staff member from the district communications team and Lena Mercer, the journalist who had first helped bring her story into daylight. They didn't speak much. There wasn't anything to say. The room beyond the curtain was packed, and Ayanna knew every camera would be pointed at her the moment she stepped into view. Not because they cared who she was, but because she was the only one who hadn't yet spoken into a microphone. The superintendent went first. She stood behind the podium, reading from a printed statement, her voice careful and composed. Words like failure to act and re-evaluation of policy passed through the speakers with all the weight of damp leaves. She acknowledged the incidents, expressed regret, thanked Ayanna for her courage, and promised a commitment to equity and accountability. Applause followed, soft and scattered, more out of obligation than conviction. Then Hughes stepped forward, not to speak, but to introduce Ayanna. His words were brief. She didn't ask for a podium. She didn't ask for cameras, but she earned them. Then he stepped aside. Ayanna walked out slowly, the soles of her shoes silent against the wood. She wore no makeup, no bright colors, just a black blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled into a simple bun, her expression unreadable but steady. She didn't touch the mic at first. She stood behind it, scanning the crowd, taking in the sea of faces, some expectant, some suspicious, some curious, some already looking for the quote they could type first. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "My name is Ayanna Blake. No flashbulbs, no murmurs. I didn't come here to talk about what happened to me. That part's already been covered, repeated, analyzed. You've all seen the video. You've read the timeline. You've drawn your conclusions. What I came here to do today is tell you what that moment meant and what it didn't." She paused, letting the quiet stretch across the room. "It didn't mean I was violent. It didn't mean I was unstable. It didn't mean I was dangerous. It meant I was tired. Tired of being humiliated. Tired of pretending silence was strength. Tired of being expected to take it, absorb it, carry it without complaint, Because I didn't fit what this place was used to. She didn't blink as cameras clicked. They cut my hair, but they didn't break me. They laughed, but they didn't win. And when I stood up, not just in that room, but in the days after, I didn't stand for myself. I stood for every student who's been told they were too much, too loud, too angry, too black. I stood because nobody else would. The words didn't rush. They flowed, measured even, as if she were walking a path one deliberate step at a time. They didn't expect me to fight back. Not because they thought I couldn't, but because they thought I wouldn't be allowed to. They thought the system would protect them, like it always had, and for a while, it did, until it didn't. There was a weight to the stillness in the room now. Reporters stopped typing. Phones were lowered. Ayanna leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to pull everyone closer. I don't want your pity. I don't want to be your symbol. What I want is accountability that doesn't wait until someone's hurt. What I want is protection that doesn't depend on headlines. What I want is a school where dignity isn't something you earn by staying quiet, but something you're given, because you're human. Another pause, this one not for effect, but for breath. I've been asked a lot what I want now, what justice looks like, and I don't know that I have one answer. But I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want apologies with no action. I don't want promises that fade in a week. And I don't want to be the only one. She exhaled slowly. This place can be better, if it chooses to be. She stepped back from the mic then, not with dramatic flair, not with a bow, but with the same quiet strength she had carried since the beginning. She didn't need the room's approval. She had already taken everything they tried to strip from her and woven it into something unbreakable. There was no applause at first, just silence. Then one hand, then another. Then the room rose, not with cheers, but with a deep, measured respect. The kind that doesn't come from performance, but from truth that cannot be denied. Ayanna walked off the stage, past the cameras, past the spotlights, past the rows of faces that had once pretended not to see her. She was done being invisible. The days that followed the press conference were quiet, in a way that felt different from the silences before. This wasn't the hush of avoidance or the weight of unspoken judgment. It was the stillness that came after something had broken open, after the walls that once held the truth in check had finally collapsed. There was no flood of instant change. The school didn't transform overnight. The same walls stood, the same teachers taught, and the same students filled the halls between bells, but the way they looked at Ayanna had changed. And so had the way the air moved around her. For the first time, they saw her. Some didn't know what to do with that. A few avoided her altogether, their eyes dropping the moment she passed. Others watched her openly, unsure of what they were allowed to feel. But there were a few, a very few, who nodded. Small gestures, muted acknowledgments, not grand, not performative, just recognition. The district moved quickly after that. Policy updates were drafted and released, including mandatory training on racial bias and student dignity, language that had never existed in their handbook before. An anonymous reporting platform was introduced, monitored directly by an independent oversight group. The principal was formally commended for his conduct during the investigation, though Hughes barely acknowledged the gesture. He wasn't interested in praise. His work had never been about recognition. Ayanna passed him in the hallway a week later, on her way to class, and he simply said, "Well done." She nodded once, and that was all. The school board's final report included a rare statement of failure, couched in bureaucratic language. Yes, but there in black and white. It named the pattern. It acknowledged the harm, and while it didn't rewrite history, it planted something in its place. A record, a mark, a scar, maybe, but a visible one. Austin transferred 2 weeks later. No announcement, no ceremony, just an absence. His locker cleared overnight, his name removed from the roster. No one spoke about it directly, but the space he left behind was more than physical. It was a shift in the balance that had ruled the school for years. Unspoken hierarchies, protected arrogance, the kind of power that thrived only in darkness. Now, there was light in places it had never reached. But it wasn't just about them. Ayana's victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in her presence, in the way she walked into the cafeteria without shrinking, in the way she returned to the art room, not to reclaim it, but to show that she didn't need to, in the way students looked up when she spoke now, not because they feared her, but because they knew she wouldn't waste words. She had become something permanent. One afternoon, as the semester drew closer to its end, a younger girl stopped her in the hallway. She was quiet, unsure, maybe 14, her backpack nearly swallowing her frame. "You're Ayana, right?" she asked, voice small but steady. Ayana paused. "Yeah." The girl nodded, eyes wide. "Thanks for what you did. They used to mess with my cousin. They don't anymore." Ayana didn't say much. She just smiled, small, tired, but real, and kept walking. And at home, for the first time in a long time, her parents began to notice the difference. Her mother sat with her one evening, watching the muted news on television. Ayana's name scrolling across the bottom of the screen. She didn't say much, just placed a cup of tea in front of her and said, "We're proud." The words didn't erase everything, but they settled deep, like warmth in winter. Later that week, Ayana returned to the boxing gym where her cousin Darius still trained. The place hadn't changed much. The same dim bulbs, the same smell of sweat and canvas, the same muffled echo of fists on pads. Darius watched her from across the room as she wrapped her hands, slower now, more deliberate. He didn't ask questions. He just tossed her a pair of gloves and said, "You ready?" She stepped into the ring with the kind of calm that couldn't be taught. I never stopped. They moved through drills without talking, just the rhythm of motion, the repetition of strength rediscovered. Between rounds, she leaned against the ropes, breathing steady, her hands loose. "You didn't swing too soon," Darius said, eyes never leaving hers. "You waited. Then you finished." Ayana nodded. "And now?" he asked. She looked past him, out into the gym, into everything beyond it. "Now I teach someone else how." He smiled then, not prideful, not boasting, just satisfied. "You finally understand," he said. Ayana didn't need to answer. She already had. The last weeks of the semester passed in a slow drift, not in the way time disappears when nothing happens, but in the way it lingers when everything has already changed. The building looked the same, but it no longer felt like a place she had to survive. Ayana moved through its halls without tension in her shoulders, without scanning for the next confrontation, without wondering who might try her patience or her silence. It wasn't that the world had become safe. It was that she no longer felt small inside it. She had stopped carrying her notebook, not because she didn't need it anymore, but because others had started to take up the work themselves. A group of students had formed an accountability committee, informal, unofficial, but present. They kept notes. They asked questions. They listened. And when they passed her in the halls, they didn't ask for her approval. They just nodded, like they already knew what she'd taught without ever having to say it aloud. She saw Principal Hughes less often now. His work had doubled, maybe tripled, after the district's response, but the brief moments they did share were always marked by the same understanding that what they'd built together didn't need repeating. It lived in the systems now, in the training sessions quietly added to the calendar, in the shifts in tone during staff meetings, in the fact that students who looked like her no longer had to earn their humanity one interaction at a time. One afternoon, near the end of the year, she passed his office just as he stepped out to retrieve a stack of reports from the copier. "You think they'll keep it going?" she asked, voice calm but curious. He looked up, a glimmer of fatigue behind his eyes, but something steady behind that. "Some will," he said, "and the rest will adjust." She nodded, more a gesture of understanding than agreement. "That enough for you?" he asked. "It's enough to begin," she replied. Outside the building, spring had finally broken through the long chill. The trees lining the school's perimeter bloomed in bursts of white and pale green, and the students had begun lingering on the front steps after the bell, caught in that strange space between endings and beginnings. Ayanna walked past them without needing to measure her pace, without calculating her expression. She didn't need to hold herself together anymore. She was whole. Word had spread that Austin's family had moved. Quietly, no ceremony, no farewell. The house was sold to a couple with 2 young children, and by the end of the month, someone else's car sat in his usual spot. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt finished. What mattered now wasn't where they had gone, but what she had stayed to build. At home, the atmosphere had softened. Her parents had never become suddenly attentive or overflowing with emotion, but there were small shifts. Dinners eaten together, questions asked without agenda, her father occasionally watching the news clips of her interview without saying much, just nodding slightly when her name was mentioned. It wasn't repair, but it was recognition. On the final week of school, she returned to the same spot in the cafeteria where it had all begun. She didn't sit in the shadows this time. She sat near the center, surrounded not by a crowd, but by calm. A new student, a girl with a shy voice and dark eyes, passed her on the way to an empty seat. Ayanna caught her gaze, then gestured. "You can sit here," she said. The girl paused, surprised. Then she sat. They didn't talk much, just shared space, the kind that had once been denied to her and now belonged to both of them. Later that afternoon, as students filed out for summer break, she passed the glass doors and paused beneath the school's motto, "Excellence through community." For the first time, it didn't feel ironic, not because the school had lived up to it, but because she had. She walked home slowly that day, not in a hurry, letting the sun settle into her shoulders. She passed the corner store, the bus stop, the apartment building with the peeling paint, and the kids laughing on the steps. These streets were hers, in a way the school had never fully been. But now they were connected. Now they belonged to the same story. That night she stood in her room, pulling the last of her books from her bag, and found the old braid tucked between the pages of a journal she hadn't opened in weeks. She held it for a long moment, not with pain, but with reverence. Then she placed it gently in a box, closed the lid, and set it on the highest shelf in her closet, not to forget, but to remember who she'd become after they tried to take something from her. She didn't need a monument. She was one. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great